They called her nurse with a sneer, as if her presence in the heart of a warzone was a clerical error, a misplaced name on a roster meant for warriors. But Sarah Mitchell, a young combat medic with steady hands and a heart forged in the fires of loss, carried a legacy no one in her unit could have fathomed. Why did these battle-hardened soldiers who once dismissed her as fragile end up owing their lives to her unyielding resolve? How did a woman, underestimated at every turn, become the linchpin of a mission that turned the tide of a deadly ambush? And what hidden strength, passed down through a whispered family oath, drove her to defy the odds and earn a commander's salute? Welcome to Silent Stories, where we unearth the untold tales of courage that echo beyond the battlefield, stories of those who rise when no one believes they can. Join us as we uncover the remarkable journey of Sarah Mitchell. The Afghan sun scorched forward operating base, FOB. Thunder, a dusty outpost carved into the rugged Helmand province. The air was thick with the acrid tang of diesel, and the faint metallic bite of gunpowder carried on a relentless wind that whipped sand into every crevice of the camp. Jagged peaks loomed in the distance, their silhouettes blurred by heat waves that danced across the horizon. The rhythmic thump of distant mortar fire punctuated the silence, a grim reminder that danger was never far away. For 6 grueling weeks, Sarah Mitchell, a 24-year-old combat medic, had been assigned to the 3rd Battalion, a unit of grizzled infantrymen who viewed her as an outsider in their world of grit and gunfire. To them, she was a liability, her medical kit a poor substitute for the rifles they wielded with pride. Each dawn, as the first rays of light painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Sarah began her ritual in the medical tent, a canvas shelter that swayed in the desert wind. She didn't join the soldiers on perimeter patrols or take a post on the watchtowers. Instead, she prepared her trauma kits with meticulous care, her fingers moving with the precision of a watchmaker as she checked tourniquets, bandages, and morphine syringes. Her hands, calloused yet gentle, betrayed no trace of the youth in her face. They were hands shaped by a legacy passed down from her father, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, a legendary Green Beret medic who had saved countless lives in the jungles of Vietnam before his death when Sarah was just 10. "You don't heal to prove a point," he told her, his voice steady as he taught her to stitch wounds on scraps of cloth in their modest Montana home. "You heal to keep hope alive, to give someone a tomorrow." At FB Thunder, hope was a scarce commodity. The soldiers, hardened by months of relentless skirmishes with Taliban fighters, saw Sarah's presence as an affront to their tightly knit brotherhood. "Stay out of the way, nurse," Staff Sergeant Daniel Holt would mutter, his voice dripping with condescension as he passed her tent. Holt, a towering figure with scars crisscrossing his forearms like a map of his 4 combat deployments, was the unit's de facto leader, a man who wore his experience like armor. To him, Sarah's medical training was secondary to the real work of war, engaging the enemy, holding ground, surviving. The others followed his lead, their smirks and sidelong glances a constant reminder that she was unwelcome. "Hope you're good at paperwork, Mitchell," Private Carter jeered one morning, his voice carrying over the clatter of mess hall trays. "That's all you'll be doing out here?" Laughter rippled through the group, sharp and cutting. Sarah absorbed the taunts in silence, her hazel eyes fixed on her work. She wasn't here to argue or prove her worth with words. Her father's lessons echoed in her mind. Action speaks louder than pride. She wore his old dog tags tucked beneath her uniform, their worn metal a talisman of resilience that grounded her amidst the chaos. Her training hadn't come from textbooks alone, it was forged in the stories her father told, in the late-night drills he ran in their backyard, teaching her to stabilize a wound under pressure, to think clearly when panic threatened to take over. She'd practiced bandaging wounds on her younger brother, Tommy, who giggled as she wrapped his arm in gauze, pretending to be a wounded soldier. Those memories, bittersweet and vivid, fueled her resolve. Her father had given his life on a classified mission in Vietnam, leaving behind only his journal, a battered leather-bound book filled with notes on trauma care and cryptic reflections on the cost of war. Sarah carried it with her, a sacred relic of his sacrifice. The soldier's disdain wasn't the only challenge Sarah faced. FB Thunder was a pressure cooker, its isolation amplifying tensions. The base was under constant threat, with insurgents probing its defenses, their mortars landing closer each week. The medic's tent, a supposed safe haven, was a flimsy barrier against the realities of war. Sarah worked alongside 2 other medics, Sergeant Ramirez, a gruff veteran who treated her with distant professionalism, and Corporal Lee, a nervous rookie who clung to protocol like a lifeline. Ramirez, at least, acknowledged her competence, but even he kept her at arm's length, wary of associating with the unit's outcast. Lee, overwhelmed by the intensity of the deployment, barely spoke to her, his focus consumed by his own fears. Sarah's first real test came during a routine patrol briefing in her third week. The battalion was planning a resupply mission through a narrow valley known as the Viper's Nest, a Taliban stronghold notorious for ambushes. Sarah, studying the terrain maps pinned to the command tent's wall, noticed a critical flaw. The valley's choke points left the convoy vulnerable to enfilading fire from elevated positions, a tactic the insurgents had used to devastating effect in prior attacks. She hesitated, knowing her input would be unwelcome, but her father's voice urged her forward, speak the truth even if it's ignored. She approached Holt after the briefing, her voice calm but firm. Sergeant, if we position a quick reaction force on the eastern ridge, we can cover the convoy's flank and reduce casualties if things go south. The map shows clear sight lines from there. Holt's laugh was sharp, cutting through the hum of the tent's generator. Stick to bandaging, Mitchell. I've run this route before. We don't need your armchair tactics. His words stung, but Sarah bit back her response, retreating to her tent. She knew better than to argue with a man whose pride outweighed his reason. The mission was set for the following dawn, and Sarah was assigned to the rear vehicle, her role limited to standby medical support. She packed extra supplies, her gut telling her the day would demand more than bandages. As the convoy rolled out, the Humvees rumbled through the dusty valley, their engines growling under a sky streaked with pink. Sarah's eyes scanned the ridgelines, her senses heightened by the eerie quiet. The soldiers' radios crackled with clipped updates, their voices tense but steady. Then, without warning, the world exploded. An IED detonated beneath the lead vehicle, sending a fireball into the sky. Automatic gunfire rained down from the cliffs above, bullets pinging off the Humvees like hail on a tin roof. The Taliban had sprung their trap and the convoy was pinned in the Viper's Nest. Chaos engulfed the valley. Soldiers scrambled for cover behind rocks and disabled vehicles, returning fire as the enemy's rounds tore through the air. Holt barked orders, his voice hoarse over the radio, but the situation was unraveling fast. Two soldiers, Private Lopez and Corporal Evans, were hit in the open, their cries piercing the cacophony. Sergeant Ramirez, the senior medic, was trapped in a burning Humvee, his screams muffled by the roar of flames. Holt's voice crackled through the comms, laced with desperation. Mitchell, stay put. You're not trained for this. But Sarah was already moving, her body low, her medical kit bouncing against her spine as she sprinted toward the wounded. She reached Lopez first, a young man barely 20, clutching a gaping wound in his thigh. Blood pulsed onto the sand, dark and relentless, pooling beneath him. Sarah dropped to her knees, ignoring the bullets kicking up dirt inches from her boots. Stay with me, Lopez, she said, her voice steady as she applied a tourniquet with swift, practiced motions. Her hands moved like they were born for this moment, tightening the strap until the bleeding slowed to a trickle. She dragged him behind a boulder, shielding him with her body as she administered morphine, her fingers trembling only slightly from the adrenaline. You're gonna make it, she whispered, her words a lifeline in the storm. Lopez's eyes, wide with pain, locked onto hers, and he nodded weakly. Corporal Evans was worse off, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. Sarah recognized the signs of a tension pneumothorax, a collapsed lung filling with air, crushing his chest. With no time to hesitate, she pulled a needle decompression kit from her pack, her hands steady despite the chaos. She inserted the 14-gauge needle between his ribs, the hiss of escaping air a small victory as Evans' breathing eased. Hang on, she told him, her voice a calm anchor in the maelstrom. She marked his chest with a pen, signaling the injury for evac, and moved on, her mind racing but her focus unyielding. Holt, watching from a distance, was frozen, his rifle still raised but his eyes locked on Sarah. She was no longer the nurse he'd mocked, she was a force moving through the battlefield with a clarity that defied the pandemonium. But the ambush wasn't over. A second wave of insurgents emerged, their RPGs streaking toward the convoy. The lead Humvee exploded, sending shrapnel flying in a deadly arc. Holt took a hit to the shoulder, collapsing behind a rock, his blood soaking the sand. His radio call was weak, panicked. Medic! I need a medic! Sarah heard the call and ran, weaving through a hail of gunfire, her heart pounding but her focus razor-sharp. She reached Holt, whose face was pale, his uniform soaked with blood. Don't move, Sergeant, she said, her tone commanding as she assessed the wound. The shrapnel had torn through muscle, narrowly missing the artery. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, her hands moving with the speed and precision of a surgeon. You're not dying on my watch, she said, locking eyes with him. Holt, for once, had no retort, only a nod of stunned gratitude. As she worked, A bullet grazed her arm, tearing through her sleeve and drawing blood. She ignored it, her focus unbroken, her father's words echoing. Keep hope alive. The battle raged on, the insurgents pressing their advantage. Sarah's actions became the linchpin of the convoy's survival. She coordinated with the Quick Reaction Force, relaying precise coordinates for air support, her voice cutting through the chaos with authority. She stabilized 3 more wounded soldiers: Private Carter, whose leg was shredded by shrapnel, Specialist Nguyen, with a concussion from the blast, and Lieutenant Brooks, who'd taken a round to the abdomen. She dragged each to safety, her small frame belying the strength within, her movements a blur of efficiency. When a medevac helicopter finally arrived, its rotors kicking up a storm of dust, Sarah directed the evacuation, ensuring every injured soldier was accounted for. The insurgents, overwhelmed by the airstrike she'd called in, retreated into the hills, their ambush thwarted. The convoy limped back to FOB Thunder, battered but alive. Sarah's uniform was stained with blood, hers and others, but she stood tall, her face etched with exhaustion and resolve. The soldiers, once her detractors, now looked at her with a mix of awe and shame. Holt, his arm in a sling, approached her in the medical tent as she cleaned her wound. His voice was low, raw with emotion. "Mitchell, I was wrong. You're not just a medic. You're the best damn soldier I've ever seen." His salute was slow, deliberate, a gesture that carried the weight of his newfound respect. The other soldiers followed suit, their salutes a silent apology for every taunt, every doubt. Private Carter, his leg bandaged, met her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Sarah." It was the first time anyone had used her first name. That night, alone in her tent, Sarah pulled out her father's journal, its pages worn from years of handling. She traced his handwriting, a passage standing out: "Courage isn't loud. It's the quiet choice to act when others falter." A tear fell, not from weakness, but from the realization that she'd honored his legacy. She added her own entry detailing the day's events, the lives she'd saved, the doubts she'd silenced. It was a new chapter in a story that began long before her. But the weight of the day lingered. She thought of her brother, Tommy, now a college student back home, unaware of the dangers she faced. She'd promised to write him, to tell him she was safe, but the words felt hollow. How could she explain the blood, the screams, the moments when she wasn't sure she'd survive? The ambush in the Viper's Nest was only the beginning. Over the next month, FOB Thunder faced escalating attacks, the insurgents growing bolder. Sarah's role expanded beyond the medical tent. She trained the soldiers in basic trauma care, teaching them to apply tourniquets and recognize shock, her calm instruction earning their respect. She worked alongside Ramirez, who began to defer to her judgment, and mentored Lee, helping him overcome his fear. But the true test came during a nighttime raid on a Taliban safe house, a mission that would push Sarah to her limits. The target was a compound deep in the mountains, a hub for insurgent operations. Intelligence suggested hostages, local civilians, were being held inside. The battalion was tasked with neutralizing the threat and rescuing the captives. Sarah was assigned to the assault team, a decision that raised eyebrows among the soldiers. Holt, now her staunchest ally, silenced their objections. "She's earned her place," he said, his tone brooking no argument. The mission launched under a moonless sky, the team moving silently through the rocky terrain. Sarah carried her medical kit and a sidearm, her senses heightened by the weight of the task. The raid began smoothly, the team breaching the compound's outer wall with explosives. But inside, chaos erupted. The insurgents were prepared, their gunfire lighting up the night. The hostages, terrified, were scattered across the compound, some wounded, others bound. Sarah moved with the team, her eyes scanning for threats and casualties. When a grenade detonated near the main building, 2 soldiers, Sergeant Walsh and Private Diaz, were caught in the blast. Sarah reached them amidst the smoke, her hands steady as she assessed their injuries. Walsh had a shattered arm, Diaz a head wound. She stabilized them under fire, her voice calm as she radioed for evac. But the mission took a dire turn. The team's exit route was cut off by a secondary insurgent force, pinning them inside the compound. Holt, leading the defense, was hit again, this time in the leg. Sarah dragged him to cover, her muscles screaming as she packed his wound. "Stay with me, Holt," she said, her voice fierce. "You're not done yet." As the team fought to hold their position, Sarah took charge, organizing the soldiers into a defensive perimeter. She used her father's journal, tucked in her kit, as a guide, recalling his notes on battlefield triage under siege. She prioritized the wounded, directing the team to protect the hostages while she treated injuries ranging from shrapnel wounds to burns. The turning point came when Sarah spotted a narrow path through the compound's rear, overlooked by the insurgents. She relayed the coordinates to Holt, who trusted her without question. "Lead the way, Mitchell," he said, his voice weak but resolute. Sarah guided the team, carrying a wounded hostage, a young girl no older than 12, on her back. The path was treacherous, littered with debris, but Sarah's focus never wavered. When an insurgent appeared, aiming at the team, she fired her sidearm, her shot precise, dropping him instantly. It was the first time she'd taken a life, and the weight of it hit her like a wave, but she pushed it aside. There was no time for doubt. The team escaped the compound, reaching a safe extraction point as helicopters descended. Sarah ensured every soldier and hostage was aboard before collapsing into a seat, her body trembling with exhaustion. The girl she'd carried clung to her, whispering thanks in broken English. Back at FB Thunder, the mission was hailed as a success, with all hostages rescued and minimal losses. Sarah's actions were the talk of the base, her name no longer Nurse but Doc Mitchell, a title earned through blood and courage. Weeks later, a ceremony was held at FB Thunder. The air was crisp, the soldiers' uniforms pressed, their medals glinting under the desert sun. Sarah stood on a makeshift stage, her posture humble but unyielding. A commander, Colonel Reynolds, a grizzled veteran with decades of service, stepped forward. He spoke of her father, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, a Green Beret whose name was revered among medics. "Sarah Mitchell," Reynolds said, his voice resonating across the silent crowd, "you are your father's daughter, and you've surpassed his legend." The soldiers stood, their applause a thunderous acknowledgement of her valor. Holt, still limping, led the salute, his eyes meeting hers with a respect that needed no words. Sarah took the podium, her voice steady, her words simple. "I didn't come here to prove anyone wrong. I came to keep my promise, to save those who couldn't save themselves. That's what my father taught me, and that's what I'll carry forward." The crowd was silent, not out of shock, but out of profound understanding. Her words cut through rank and prejudice, reminding them of the true heart of service. She spoke of the girl she'd saved, whose name she'd learned was Amina, and the letter Amina's family sent, thanking her for giving them back their daughter. Sarah's voice wavered only once when she mentioned her father, but she held firm, her resolve a beacon. In the months that followed, Sarah's story spread beyond FB Thunder. She was invited to train a new generation of combat medics, her methods blending her father's wisdom with her own hard-earned experience. She formed a specialized medical response unit dubbed Lifeline, a team of medics who operated in the most perilous conditions, saving lives where hope seemed lost. Her training sessions were intense, her recruits, men and women alike, chosen for their skill and heart. She taught them to move under fire, to prioritize under pressure, to carry hope into the darkest moments. "Be the calm in the storm," she told them, her voice a quiet echo of her father's. One evening, as the desert sky burned red, a sealed letter arrived, an invitation to join a covert program known as Guardian's Oath, a legacy her father had helped build. It was a network of elite medics who operated in the shadows, saving lives in missions too sensitive for public record. Sarah accepted, with conditions. Her team would be chosen for skill and ethics, not rank or gender. Every mission would prioritize saving lives, and she would pass on her knowledge to ensure the legacy endured. To her surprise, all conditions were accepted, a testament to her growing legend. Today, Sarah Mitchell stands in a hidden training facility, mentoring young medics whose eyes burn with the same fire she once carried. She teaches them not just to heal wounds, but to carry hope into the darkest moments. "Be your own guardian," she tells them, her voice calm yet firm, as she helps them practice trauma drills. Because some stories don't end, they ignite new ones. Her father's journal, now filled with her own entries, sits on a shelf, a living testament to a legacy that grows with each life she saves. Subscribe to Silent Stories if you believe courage is the quiet act of saving lives, one moment at a time.